What is up, guys? It is time for a little MLB Strategy Show, bright and early here on the West Coast, slightly less bright and early on the East Coast, but we are here with your first take on today's MLB slate, one that I'm assuming a lot of you guys diving into the NFL or the MLB DFS Deep Waters. Boy, 8 a.m. here, not the best, but we are going to take you through everything you need to know for today's 8-game slate. I am Chris Spags, joined by a man who's with me on many of these early morning journeys across the world of MLB. You know him, you love him. He's nerd-ass Greg Ehrenberg. How you doing, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, baseball in the spotlight. We got live before lock, actually before lock today. We've also got 100K to first contest on Fanduel and Draftkings. Not necessarily my favorite payout structure in the world, where it's 33% of the prize pool to first place. But either way, I mean, 6 figures to first place. I'm sure that's going to definitely get people more interested in baseball today.
Yeah, I know. I will be doing a lot of entries today on DraftKings. I'm sure a lot of you guys will as well. So make sure you are also checking out some of the stuff that we have going on at Awesemo.com, including today, free, the Top Pitchers tool. It's our free premium tool of the day. That is one thing we talk about a lot on here. The Top Stacks, the Top Pitchers tool, 2 great ways to help shorten your lineup creation process overall, but also see which plays are going to be the ones that are more important to get to above the field. And that is what the Top Pitchers tool offers. So go check that out free for the site today. And as Greg mentioned, it is a normal lock time today or normal show schedule because of the NBA not going on today. So we do have a MLB deeper dive show, which I'll be on later today with Alex and Terry. That'll be starting up at 5 p.m. Eastern. And then we have a live before lock show coming on right after that. And I think, is that you on that one? Yep, that's Aton and Greg coming up. So you get to see us both again, talk about the slate one more time later today, leading up to lock at 7:10 Eastern time. And also make sure you are playing along at OddsShopper. One of the best ways to go and place your money in sports betting is going to be through OddsShopper, where betting lines can change by the minute. And they can vary greatly depending upon which book you're using. And that's why OddsShopper is very important to your process to help you find the best lines available on the game or player prop you're betting on. It's going to give you that edge to have to beat the house, such Greg was talking about before the show. Prop lines, one of the least inefficient markets out there. And that is one thing that OddsShopper gives you a leg up on. Head over to oddshopper.awesemo.com or oddshopper.com, where you compile the best bets available for game lines, player props, player and team futures, all updated in real time. And then one last plug for you guys, especially if you are playing MLB for the first time. Some of the tools that we have at Awesemo.com are going to be major for really getting this going off the ground for yourself. So make sure you're going to Awesemo.com/join and use the promo code GOLDRUSH, where you can get 25% off your first month of Awesemo Plus. That is one of the best deals we'll have for a full membership, where you can get all the MLB data. NBA's playoff time is coming up here. We'll have all the data for that as well. MMA, PGA, all these sports, NHL playoffs, all this is going on right now. It can be at your fingertips. NASCAR as well. Really, anything you could think of is going on. That's why the promo code is Gold Rush. So go check that out at Awesemo.com/join for 25% off your first month. Greg, let's get into the slate here. Any overarching thoughts? It does seem like every single time we do a show, we do have at least one stud on the slate that is going to make lineup construction a little more obvious. And I guess today we do have a few more that you can maybe choose from, but it's a Gerrit Cole slate, Greg. So that is the main observation that we have today. Stud pitchers had over a 40% K rate this year, but any overarching observations you would give to people, especially if they are playing MLB DFS for the first time this season?
Yeah, I mean, this definitely looks like a slate to pay up for pitchers. Garrett Cole is very popular and somewhat expensive. Yu Darvish is very popular and somewhat expensive. And then we have some other fairly popular pitching options, Walker Buehler and Yusei Kikuchi. So, and we've got 4 chalk pitchers on the slate, and I kind of think rightfully so. So the way I'm going to try to differentiate is with my offenses, because I don't really think that there's a whole lot of sense in going massively contrarian a pitcher and just taking guys who are not good at the expense of the guys who are really good.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of hitting to talk about on the slate. We're going to go game by game, as we always do here on the MLB Strategy Show. So hit that like button and, of course, subscribe to the channel to make sure you're getting all the content that we have going on all day long here into your YouTube inbox. I don't even know if there's a YouTube inbox. Notification box, whatever you want to call it. First game up, we got the Mets, 3.4 implied runs against Max Fried, a guy we've talked about a lot recently, whose price tag remains pretty low because he's not pitched that well this year. Still a 1.7 whip for himself, giving up a 315 batting average. Very unlucky, 390 BABIP, and I feel like it's the same conversation we have to have about Max Fried every single time he pitches, Greg, but he's cheap. He does seem a little bit underowned on the top pitcher tool. It seems like it's worth going there again a little bit today, with Fried being a guy that's just, I think, due for positive regression. Still not the greatest strikeout guy. That's a 23% K rate this year, a 24% K rate going back to 2019. But is he a value pitcher who's in the mix for you? I feel like he has to be in the mix, but what's your confidence level with Max Fried?
Yeah, really low. I mean, he's pitched poorly this year, and even if he's been a little unlucky, you look at the underlying numbers, and sure, maybe he shouldn't have a 6.55 ERA, except the underlying numbers, he is a 5 expected ERA, is a 4.95 FIP, so all those numbers indicate a pitcher who's been bad, but maybe not quite as bad as a 6.55 ERA. At least if we're looking at the positives, he is striking out more guys this year than he has in the past, striking out well over a hitter per inning. Let's see, what are some of the batted ball numbers? Maybe no, the hard hit rate is way up. He was only allowing 23.2% of the balls hit against were hard contact last year. This year, 36.8%. So I mean, keep that in mind, and probably makes sense that he has a higher BABIP than we're used to seeing. Also, his home run to fly ball rate is up a lot this year. So I mean, Max Fried, let's see. In my initial build that I did, I got to 5% of Fried. And it's just going to be hard for me to prioritize him when I look at some of the other pitching options we have today. I get that he's cheap. He's been good in the past, but he just hasn't pitched well so far this season.
Yeah, I think it's a reasonable take. I still think for me, just the fact that he does look under-owned on the top pitchers tool, which again is one of the free tools that we have today. 12% chance of being a top pitcher, just 8% ownership. If that holds steady, I do think to me, I imagine I'll have close to 12 to 15% of them. I'm doing the DK tournament today and maxing that one out because I have to waste my money somewhere now. The NBA is not doing that for me. But I do think that going to Max Fried, I'm willing to get there a little bit more. I'm not seeing the same hard hit numbers. I don't know if I pulled it differently or not, but I have at a 22% hard contact rate this year compared to 23% going back to last season. So I'm not seeing that be that different. I still think he's just been very unlucky. And he's still never been a great strikeout guy. So to be clear, it's not a day to build around Max Fried, but I think to me, if he's coming up in an optimizer, and I think he will, based on Awesemo's projection for him today, I'm not going to run away from it against the Mets team that does have 5 guys that strike out above league average and this low implied total for him. But Greg, if you're not a believer in Max Fried, you can go to the Mets hitters here. They do also look under-owned according to the top stacks tool, about a 4.5% chance of being the top stack today, 2.5% ownership. So are you going to go the other way then if you're not playing a lot of Fried? Are you willing to take some Mets bats?
By the way, I have the data from StatCast, and StatCast has him giving up 7.4% barrel rate, which is by far the highest of his career, 36.8% hard contact rate. So that's at least where I was looking at it from. So
I got it from Fangraphs. I think that, which is also StatCast. So I don't know, but yeah, so could be something weird here that's just not pulled the right way. But either way, tell me about the Mets bats though, because I guess that could be one deciding factor. But for the main part, looking at Max Fried's production, I'm sure is enough of a case to get to hitters if you do want to go against them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we look at the Mets on this slate and only pick up 2.5% ownership. And like I said, I mean, there's still name value to Max Fried. I mean, the first half of last season, he was one of the favorites to win the NL Cy Young. And like I said, I just don't think he's that pitcher right now. It doesn't mean he can't be that guy going forward, but I mean, the Zips projection from the last of the year still has him for the rest of the year, has him with a 4.21 ERA for the rest of the season. So not terrible, but not great either. And then, I mean, like I said, you look at his numbers this year, 6.55 ERA, a 5.0 expected ERA. The BABIP is high. The home run to fly ball rate is high, but at least per the StatCast numbers, he appears to be getting hit very hard. So that all seems to line up for me. So the Mets, to me, is a stack that's going under-owned, and I think is one of the contrarian teams to look at. One thing, though, that I'm going to note here, and it's going to be pretty important with me going forward, is I've said for this slate that there's a lot of high-end pitching options who are going to be chalk, right, with Gerrit Cole and Yu Darvish in the mix. So I'm going to really try to prioritize finding cheap offenses that are also a little bit contrarian. So the Mets offense, the one issue with them, even though they're contrarian, they're kind of expensive. So I'm going to probably be not massively overweight to them, and I'm going to try to be looking more at some of the other cheap offenses just so I could fit in the stud pitchers.
Any Mets bats that you consider a priority if you are getting there? I know that there are some cheap guys in the mix that you're just hinting at, and some guys as well who have just no sample size. Jake Hager is projected to be in the lineup, and also a name of a pro wrestler. I think that's not him crossing over necessarily from MMA fighter and pro wrestler to baseball player, but he is in the mix here. You also have James McCann at a pretty cheap price. Really, the bottom of the order in particular are going to be very cheap. So, any of the Mets bats you would consider a priority if you are stacking them up?
I wouldn't say priority, but I mean, like Jonathan VR, he's let off a little bit recently. He's really cheap with stolen base upside. And also considering that Max Fried has seen his walk rate spike pretty high this year. I mean, all it takes is for him to walk Jonathan VR once. VR steals a base or two, scores a run, and you have the upside right there. So he's the guy I'm getting to the most right now. Pete Alonso for the home run upside at 4,800 on DraftKings. But overall, still, it's hard for me to get to any of these Mets bats at a really high clip.
The other side, we have Taiwan Walker, whose price is up here. And to me, this is part of why I don't mind going to Max Fried, is that Taiwan Walker is going to be $1,800 more, and Awesemo has him projected slightly worse than Max Fried today. Walker's stuff has been better in terms of strikeouts, so anybody who's played him as a chalk pitcher recently knows not the highest strikeout upside guy necessarily. does have a 23.9% K rate for him this year, going back to 2019 at 23% K rate. So pretty much around league average, a little bit better than that. Not giving up a ton of power this year either, just a 0.6% home run rate for himself. And Walker, I feel like on those other slates where he was chalk, it was sort of hard to argue him being chalk. On this slate, Greg, though, where he's priced where he is, I don't know how you get there a lot, even though he does look favorably in the top pitchers tool, a 9% chance of being a top pitcher with only 1% ownership.
Yeah, it's a really tough matchup against Atlanta. And then, like you said, also, it's not like Walker's striking out all that many guys. And he's been really lucky to have a 2.2 ERA. Overall for the season, he's still pitching, acceptably, but the 2.2 ERA that's a little bit of a mirage. He's a 4.06 expected ERA, really buoyed by really low home run to fly ball rate that isn't sustainable. And then also a 220 BABIP. So all those numbers are going to regress a little bit. And then also we look at the matchup against Atlanta, far from favorable. Combine that also with his price tag and the other pitchers that are available on the slate. And he's somebody who's pretty easy for me to stay away from.
The Atlanta hitters not going to get much leverage going there against Taiwan Walker because he's going to be mostly unknown on DraftKings. And it does seem like the Atlanta hitters are going to be priced. Actually, are they up on FanDuel at all price-wise? Let me just make sure to look that up real fast because on DraftKings, this has been something where they've been very expensive. And Greg, you have any thoughts on that? Because I know on FanDuel, they have been chalk every day recently because of their lower prices.
Yeah, they're expensive on both sites. And then, like I said before, when I was talking about the Mets, it's going to be hard for me to prioritize getting to Atlanta a ton, even though I think Taiwan Walker is going to regress a little bit just because of what the price tags are. So also something to note is that Ronald Acuna, he's been battling, an ankle injury. He stepped on first base and kind of turned it awkwardly a couple days ago. So it's unknown if he's going to be in the lineup or not tonight, but he's really expensive if he plays. And then, other guys in the lineup too, we've got Ozzie Albies is 5,000, Freddie Freeman, 5,600. And that's just something in itself that if I really want to roster Garrett Cole and or Yu Darvish on this slate for FanDuel single pitcher sites or DraftKings, if I want to pair them together, it's not really viable to do it if I want to make a stack of the Atlanta Braves hitters, unless I'm just rostering the not as good Atlanta Braves hitters, which is also not something that I really have that much interest in doing. Is if I'm going to make a Brave stack, I don't want to do it with no Acuna, no Freeman, no Albies. So with that in mind, the Braves are another team. They're picking up very low ownership. But I don't think they really fit into the kind of build that I want to make today.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable one to have. Mets bullpen also has not been that bad behind Walker either. A 3.8 exit for themselves on the year, which is one of the better marks on the slate. Only a 1% home run rate for themselves so far this season. So I would expect that. But one thing to point out too, the weather is starting to get warmer around the country, as you guys may know for yourselves. But it's important to know because I see it on my data sheet here. The weather in this one expected to be 77 degrees today. We've been seeing a lot of colder days. So keep that in mind for the pitching. That I do think you're going to see more hitting starts to pop up more just because of the ball flying around a little bit easier when it is warmer outside. Let's keep going here. We got another game with the White Sox, and the White Sox are going to be very chalky today. 4.4 implied runs for them going against J.A. Happ. J.A. Happ, one of those pitchers who this year has been, I think, had some usable fantasy days, but for the most part, not been that good. A 15% K rate for himself, not getting a lot of soft contact, only an 11% soft contact rate for himself, in addition to a 48% fly ball rate that is going to, again, get worse as that weather heats up. And Happ at his price tag, this is part of the reason, too, like why I don't mind going to Max Fried very much. J.A. Happ's the same price tag with a much worse projection, and I'm sure some people will go there today, even though we have projected for just under 1% ownership on DraftKings. J.A. Happ, though, really not offering up a lot, Greg, unless you feel differently here and want to get some potential leverage against a very chalky White Sox stack.
No, Happ is even if he pitches okay, I can't really see the fantasy upside because he is not generating any swing and misses at this point in his career. Happ is now 38 years old. He's striking out 5.4 hitters per 9 innings. His velocity is way down this year. So he is throwing 90.5 miles per hour. That's his average velocity on his fastball. That's down from 91.7 last year, 92 the year before. So we're looking at guys in his late 30s now who've seen a pretty significant drop off in skill, allowing a lot more runs now. And then also the strikeouts just aren't there. So for him to have a game that's okay, I think it's just going to look a lot like the White Sox hitting a lot of balls hard at fielders. I don't think it's going to be a thing where J.A. Happ goes pitches, 6 innings, strikes out 8 guys or anything like that. So to me, Happ is not a pitcher I want to get to.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways here for it to go poorly for Happ. And even if he does survive, it's hard to expect him to have that strikeout upside, given the fact that he does have just a 15% K rate for himself this year. And the lineup, too, for the White Sox, this is including Nick Madrigal, who hasn't struck out at all versus a lefty, but only an 18% aggregate K rate for their projected lineup today, 22% K rate for them overall in the year against lefties. It's not a great strikeout matchup, even though the White Sox do hit for power. And that is something that is going to lead to a lot of ownership for the White Sox today, Greg. You have guys projected for over 20% ownership, the Tim Andersons and Luis Garcias of the world. Louis Garcia in particular, I would not be opposed to just take him out of player pools. He's very cheap on DraftKings, but I don't see the power upside for him to pay off if a quarter of the field's going to be on him. But how are you feeling about these White Sox hitters? Is there any of them that you'd be willing to go to here? And is there any way to stack them up without being with a very, very chalky configuration that a lot of the field is going to be on?
Let me look at some of the individual ownerships for these guys, because it looks like they're kind of just popular across the board. We've got 20% ownership going to Tim Anderson right now, and they've got double-digit ownership to Abreu, Moncada, Yerman Mercedes. So actually, the one who I think is the best overall value is Nick Madrigal. You mentioned that he hasn't struck out against a left-handed pitcher yet this year. He's hit towards the top of the order in recent games against left-handed pitching. I think the last 3 games against lefties, Madrigal's hit second. So at a $3,000 price tag, if he's going to come in under 10% ownership, to me, he's a guy that would make sense, not just in White Sox stacks, but also as a one-off. And then Andrew Vaughn, who is also cheap on both Fanduel and DraftKings, and came into the year as one of the top hitting prospects in baseball. He's had a couple of bad games in a row, but before then, he'd hit 2 home runs in 3 games. He had a handful of games in a row where he had double-digit fantasy points. So Andrew Vaughn and Nick Madrigal, those are 2 guys to me that I actually think make for good values and also only have single-digit ownership.
Yeah, Vaughn should be regressing a little bit against lefty pitching. Obviously, he's only faced 30 batters so far this year, 30 lefty pitchers, so far this year. But he does have a 304 ISO against lefties, pretty noticeable splits, a 207 WRC plus against lefties. He's been getting much better results, 56% hard contact rate against lefties as well. So I think that's something to keep in mind with Vaughn, where I agree, like he's a cheap guy. If people are going to treat him or like a Billy Hamilton, who's also the same price tag, I would definitely rather have Vaughn here. Hamilton certainly has some speed that Happ is actually one of Happ's strengths, that he doesn't give up a lot of stolen bases, but really nothing else that Billy Hamilton offers, whereas Vaughn actually does have pop and is clearly in a good spot as well. So I agree with you, Vaughn. To me, one way to get that ownership product down and just include him, even if he is hitting in the 7 hole. The other side, we have Dallas Kykel going against Minnesota. Kykel's going to have 4.6 implied runs against him. And Kykel, for the most part, a pitcher who does spike those random fantasy upside days, Greg, but a guy this year, a 10% K rate for himself, a velocity down to 88.6 miles per hour. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of reason to play Dallas Kykel on the slate, despite a very cheap price tag.
No, not at all. And let's see, Dallas Kykel, what would you guess is the most fantasy points he has scored this season?
This season, I don't think I've seen him have one of those random 10 strikeout days that he has like once a year. So I feel like for him, most has to be 14 and a half.
Yeah, he had a game with 14.15 against the Reds. But I mean, his other starts this year, 1 fantasy point, 14 that one, 8.7, 13, 9, 5, 7, 7. So just looking at a guy who at this point in his career, Dallas Keuchel, pitch to contact guy, obviously at one point was one of the premier starting pitchers in the American League. Did it with a very heavy ground ball rate and pitch to contact a lot. But even then, he was somebody who was able to strike out, like 8 hitters per 9 innings. He is not striking out anybody this year, and his walk rate has gone up. So I think he's pretty lucky to have a 4.53 ERA. He has a 5.65 expected ERA, and almost walking the same amount of guys that he's striking out. And with his inability to generate swing and misses at this point in his career, and that he's always been a guy who's thrown under 90 miles per hour, pretty big concerns for me about the viability of Dallas Keuchel as a major league pitcher going forward.
Yeah, Kikel also not pitching that deep into games either, only 5.4 innings pitched per start this year. So it's not like you're getting him, getting 7 innings of outs even as part of it. So there's really, I would agree, a lot of things to not like about Kikel, and the fact that he's also just looking worse across the board. That xFIP is up to 4.6 this year compared to 4.2 historically. I think there are some worrying signs for Kikel, and there's already enough worrying signs because he doesn't get strikeouts for the most part. The Minnesota hitters, though, probably going to have a hard time getting the things going against Kikel on their end. Only a 1.1 launch angle single allowed by Kykel this year, and the exit velocity has also been very low for him, and that is what Kykel does well. But Minnesota is certainly able to get results against anybody that I wouldn't begrudge going to Minnesota stacks. But great, they look over-owned again. I guess in particular, Kyle Garlick going to be another value option people take a lot up top in the leadoff spot at 2,400 on DK in the projected lineup. But it does seem to me like Minnesota, you could stack them up, I guess. I just don't have the highest faith. It's a pretty good bullpen behind Kykel too. I just don't know that this is one that I want to be at if it is going to be over-owned according to the top stack tool.
Yeah, I mean, there are ways to stack them and get different, but the issue would be is just that the bats are really expensive. So like Josh Donaldson's really overpriced at 5,400, and for sure he has upside going up against the left-hand pitcher in Kykel. Nelson Cruz, I think that he's somebody who you could use to differentiate yourself a little bit from some of the other top bats at the outfield position, but it's another offense that I think looks a little bit over-owned. And they're also expensive to the point where they kind of prohibit my ability to be able to roster guys like Yu Darvish and Garrett Cole. So the Twins right now do not look like a team that I am going to have a whole lot of interest in stacking. I'd rather go to teams that are cheaper and more contrarian. Like you said, even if we want to go with some of the cheaper bats, like Kyle Garlick as a one-off, fine, but he's 22% owned. And to me, almost any hitter that's 22% owned, unless it's just some sort of, crazy kind of price discount where it's like Mike Trout is too cheap in a really good matchup, like somebody like Kyle Garlick probably doesn't ever warrant being 22% rostered.
Yeah, it's not, and this is not a great comparison because this guy's not a good hitter either, but like Rob Refsnyder's projected to be in the lineup too for $300 less, and he doesn't have as much pop as Garlick does. Garlick certainly 288 ISO compared to Refsnyder's 0.050 ISO, but for just in terms of a lineup construction and a guy who could get extra at bats if Minnesota does go off, like I think I might be inclined to just take Refsnyder at 10% and cut Garlick's ownership down to 10% too, just in the hopes that you can get something to go here. So that's, you do want to stack the Twins. It's one thing to keep in mind, like Greg's talking about here, that Garlick's a fine hitter and he's had a good price tag hitting in the leadoff spot if that's where he does hit, but 24% owned or 22% ownership for a guy like that, just not somewhere that I'd want to be a bunch. Out of the high price guys, Greg, is there anybody that stands out particularly for you as a one-off guy? I feel like Nelson Cruz against lefty has been something that hasn't paid off a bunch so far this year, but when it does pay off, I think especially with the weather starting to heat up, anything Cruz, that 406 ISO against lefties to me is always going to jump out.
Yeah, Nelson Cruz would be one guy to look at as a one-off, but once again, he's also somewhat popular at 12% ownership. So, I mean, Nelson Cruz, let's see, my initial build, how much exposure do I have to him? I have 15%, so at least a little bit overweight to the field currently. So that's fine. But once again, like the Twins are a team I'm going to be underweight to the field on.
Also, one underrated part that you guys can't see at home is that every time we mention Nelson Cruz, an important baseball player to talk about for MLB DFS is our producer Tyler just throwing up a shrug or some sort of concerned response because of his part, I guess, in the Rangers not winning a World Series 10 years ago. So just something to keep in mind here for your personal enjoyment out there. Know whenever we mention Nelson Cruz that our producer Tyler is having possibly a seizure at some point during the show. Next game up, we got Washington, 3.6 implied runs going against Adbert Alzolay. Adbert Alzolay, a guy who's strikeout stuff has started to materialize in a more major way this year. 29% K rate for himself. The rest of the stats too looking pretty good. Just a 0.88 whip, a 3.4 xFIP for himself this year is Alzolay's numbers. The price tag as well looks good, and Awesemo's projection for him looks pretty good. In addition to that, on the top pitchers tool, it does seem like he's a bit under-owned, and 8% ownership expected for him on DraftKings compared to a 14% chance of being a top pitcher. The result for me, Greg, is that I know there are Washington hitters to be afraid of. Juan Soto, Trey Turner in particular, two guys that you always have to worry about in the Washington lineup. But I do think Alzolay seems worth getting to some exposure with at a reasonable price tag. But how are you feeling about Alzolay in this spot going against Washington?
I mean, in the build I did this morning, I had him in 2% of my lineup. So not an outright fade, but definitely not a high priority play either. Number one matchup is number one issue is the matchup going up against Washington. And then also just the price point. If he was a lot cheaper, then I think you'd make a little bit more sense for the strikeout upside. But at 8,100, that's a little steep for him as an SP2. I think that's the most expensive he's been all season. I'll have to double check that. But he's somebody who I think generally warrants to be a little bit. Oh, he was 9,600 last game randomly on a 2-game slate. But other than that, he's always been in the 7,000 range. And the other issue here with Alzolay is that he doesn't work deep enough into games to generally have a ton of fantasy upside. So he scored over 18 fantasy points once the entire season. It's because he's never pitched more than 6 innings. He's generally pitching 4 or 5 and topping out at 6 innings. So with that in mind, the inability to work deep into games is something that's overall capped the upside of Alzolay.
It's not a great strikeout matchup either, which I think is the one thing that'll give me some concern. I imagine I'll still be a little bit above the field here if that ownership does hold at 8%, but you do have a lineup that only strikes out 22%, a little bit under that against right-hand pitching on the year. The projected lineup has a 22.8% K rate, but both numbers still going to be under league average. So I think Alzolay has been a good strikeout pitcher. Again, has that 29% K rate for himself this year, but still, I think the main thing also jumps out too. It is a cooler day in Chicago today, 55-degree weather expected there. So compared to some of the other parks we're talking about, I think it does help Alzolay out a bit more. So I'll probably be there, but if it would be easier if you were going against the Brewers or somebody like that, somebody you know is going to have a team that's going to have a lot of strikeouts. But Greg, on the other side, we do have the Washington hitters. They are priced pretty expensively. At least the quality guys are. That you can get a cheap Josh Harrison, the 2-hole if you want, even though his splits against righties have not been that good over the last few seasons, a .091 ISO for himself. But how are you feeling about the Washington hitters? It does seem like they are a little bit underowned according to the top stacks tool. And if you don't like Alzolay, I have to think you might get a little bit of Washington.
Yeah, so one guy who makes sense to me as a one-off is Kyle Schwarber, who's reasonably priced on both Fanduel and Draftkings, and he got off to a really slow start this year, but it looks like it's been a little bit better as of late. He has, last 4 games, he had 1 game where he went hitless, but the other games, 13 fantasy points, 30 fantasy points, and 19 fantasy points. So Kyle Schwarber, who's been a really good hitter, particularly against right-handed pitchers for the last few years, at some point I expect his overall counting stats to pick up and for him to become one of the stronger, well, not necessarily one of the overall best hitters in baseball, but to be somebody who's well above average. Because if you look at the numbers for Kyle Schwarber, he's always produced WRC plus well over 100. And it's also a pretty good lineup that he's in with Washington. So there's going to be a lot of guys there to help buoy his counting stats. Last full season for Kyle Schwarber, when he was with Chicago, he had a 121 WRC plus, and for his career, he's a 112 WRC plus. So going forward, I expect pretty good things from Schwarber, especially in this offense. So with his price still cheap, he's somebody who I think is a contrarian one-off, makes sense on both sites.
And John Lester, the pitcher on the other side of this game. And again, I feel like as we go game by game here, I think maybe people out there could start to see the case being made for Max Fried a little bit more as we go. But John Lester in that same price point or close to it, 6,600 on DK. And Lester this year has been even worse than he has been historically. His velocity is down to 88.8 miles per hour. XFIP is up to 4.7. Strikeout rate down to 15%. And he hasn't given up home runs. So I guess that is the one thing that you can say for John Lester. It's been a positive, but everything else for him looks pretty bad, Greg. And I don't see a reason. I guess the top pitcher tool does have him being underowned because nobody will be rostering him today with a 2.5% chance of him being the top pitcher on the slate. But besides that, I just don't see anything positive about John Lester, I guess, other than the fact that he hasn't given up a home run this year.
Yeah, and so in our top stacks tool, the Cubs are overall the team with the best leverage score. This is the team that is the most underowned of any team on the slate. 9.3% chance of being the top scoring team of the day, but only a 5.5% ownership share. Lester's just really sucked. He sucked last year. This year, at least his ERA looks fine at 2.25, but he's only pitched 16 innings, so I'm not putting too much weight into that. His velocity is still under 90 miles per hour, and he's been buoyed by, like you said, the 0% home run rate, which isn't going to be sustained going forward because last year he had a 15.1% home run to fly ball rate, the year before 14.6%, and he still has underlying numbers that are nowhere near the 2.25 ERA, 4.11 expected ERA. So I think his numbers are probably more likely to be in line with what they were last year, 5.16 ERA, a 5.68 expected ERA. Zips projects him to have a 5.16 ERA for the rest of this season. So to me, John Lester is definitely a pitcher to attack. I understand there's a little bit of name value there, except he's so far removed from the pitcher he used to be.
He's not giving up a lot of barreled balls this year, but only has faced 66 batters so far. So, that's something that's probably going to pop up a little bit more, especially as the weather does heat up. But Cubs hitters, you mentioned here, they are one of the more underowned teams according to the top stacks tool. And a lot of that ownership is going to be going to Wilson Contreras up top, a catcher option that is actually good on a slate where there are very few to go to. But besides that, there's not a ton of ownership going to these guys. I guess Chris Bryant at the number 2 hole should be pretty decently owned, but still under 10%. I feel like the Cubs stack appealing to go to here. I think the one issue is that they do strike out a little bit more than you'd like to see with a 27% K rate on the year against left-hand pitching. But that to me is sort of nickel and diming here. The fact that the Cubs don't look that highly owned. And if you want to get that ownership product down, just I guess playing less Contreras could be an easy move. So really not a lot of ways for me to object to this Cubs stack, Greg, but do you find any hitters to be a priority?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of guys that are really expensive here, except there are also some cheaper hitters that I think make sense. Like Matt Duffy, who is now been moved up in the batting order for the Cubs. So he's hit 5th the last couple of games. He has 4 hits in the last 2 games in that lineup spot. So I mean, to me, him at a cheap price on both FanDuel and DraftKings, I think that he's somebody who makes sense to save some money with. And then Ian Happ, who is somebody who's been a quality hitter also for a fairly long time at the big league level and missed a bunch of time with an injury. I forget exactly what the injury was. It was he had bruised ribs, I think it was, after getting hit by a pitch. But since getting called up from the injured list, he's homered twice in the last 3 games. Also, he's let off in a couple of those spots. So Ian Happ, he's also somebody who's cheap because of the missed time, both FanDuel and DraftKings. So I understand the guys with a lot of name value in the Cubs lineup, like Chris Bryant, Anthony Rizzo, those guys are expensive. But looking at guys like, Matt Duffy and Ian Happ, I think that those are 2 good targets that you could use to make a Cubs stack, number one, viable, but then also to the point, like you said, there's no ownership going here. So this is the kind of spot that I like to attack for MLB.
All right, let's go to our next game here. And guys, if ever you are missing one of these shows that we're doing on YouTube, shows like the NBA Strategy Show, the MLB Strategy Show, the ones with a longer shelf life that aren't a deeper dive or live before lock, make sure you're checking out the Awesemo Podcast Network at awesemo.com/podcast. If you give any podcasts on there, obviously subscribe to them all. Check out the ones that are relevant to sports you're playing on a daily basis, but make sure you're also giving these podcasts 5 stars and a review with either your Twitter account or your email address left in your review on there, because you'll be entered to win a free week of Awesemo Plus. When you do that, those get given away every single Friday. So make sure you're doing that at awesemo.com/podcast. Just one other way, if you are a person out there who's finding it hard to pay for an Awesemo membership, that's one way that we try to give for you guys out there, where you help us out and we give you guys some free memberships back. So go check them all out at awesemo.com/podcast and leave some ratings and reviews for yourselves. Next game up, we got the Yankees, 4.9 implied runs against Jordan Lyles. Lyles, a pitcher on the year who has offered very little as well, giving up a 295 batting average, a 1.6 whip for himself, an under-league average strikeout rate of 21%. And Lyles too jumps out. He's given up a 19-degree launch angle for himself, along with a 92 exit velocity, both 2 of the worst marks on the slate. Going against a Yankees team who has a ton of power, I think this Yankee stack is going to be much more appealing than Jordan Lyles, and I think the field's going to think that as well. They look over-owned according to the top stacks tool. Is there any world, though, Greg, where you would play Jordan Lyles, a guy who's pitching about 5 innings per start and maybe just has to be due for some positive regression just because he's been that bad this year?
No, I mean, he's been so bad for basically his entire career. It's actually kind of crazy that he's been in the big leagues this long. So, man, I understand maybe a little boosted because he spent time at Coors Field, although actually some of the best ERAs of his career was when he pitched in Colorado at Coors Field, because for his career now, he's been in the big leagues since 2011. So a 10-year big league career with an ERA over 5. It's kind of crazy that some of these guys just stick around for forever, I guess, because they're veterans. So it doesn't even matter that he hasn't had success. Teams just like, hey, he's pitched for a while. Let's let him keep pitch. But I mean, he has a 6.63 ERA this year. He had a 7.02 ERA last year. So I have absolutely no interest in him. Where the question becomes now is with the New York Yankees, who are once again extremely popular. And how many times have we seen this with the Yankees this year, where they've been a popular stack and then they just end up shitting the bed by the time the slate's over? I feel like this has happened 24 times this season. They've been the most popular stack in something like 50% of the slates this year. And sure, it's a good enough spot where I'm definitely going to get some exposure to them, just not nearly as much as the field, because when we have an 8-game slate and there's a bunch of offenses in good spots, I don't think 15% ownership is warranted for any one offense.
I'm a little more inclined to go here just because they are playing in Texas. Texas weather starting to heat up too, and you're going against Lyles, so you're kind of getting the combination of both those factors. I do think you have to be clever with how you're stacking this up if you can, and trying to get less LeMahieu, I think, is something I wouldn't be opposed to, just because he has less pop in the leadoff spot and will be owned higher than pretty much everybody in this lineup. I guess Brent Gardner too, that's another way you can go if you don't want to go there to decrease the ownership. He's projected for over 20% ownership on DraftKings, but I think for me, just because of the spot against Lyles and the fact that it is a good park that also is going to be playing hotter than usual, I'm willing to go to the Yankees with the field, because I just think there are some ways you can go. Like Luke Voigt's going to be under 10% owned. Clint Frazier will be closer to 5% owned. Both those guys have enough power to get it done. So that's how I'm viewing it, Greg. But I guess tell me then, you mentioned that there's just too much ownership. Are you taking the Yankees out of the player pool entirely? Or are you just focusing on them as one-offs? How are you trying to chop that up if you are trying to get any Yankees exposure, but they are so highly owned?
I'm just underweight to the field on them. So right now in the initial build I did, which I always do for these morning shows, which it's obviously never my final lineups, but it's just I get up in the morning. It's like, all right, based on the ownership and what we have overall team projected in the top stacks tool, some of the pitchers available, I'll start making some dummy lineups based around that. And right now I have 6% Yankee stacks in that build. So it's not that they're out of my player pool entirely, but I mean, that's, less than half of the percentage that the field currently has, because we have them projected for 15% ownership. So it's definitely a team where it's such a good spot that I think that totally fading them wouldn't be wise. But it's just hard for me to prioritize getting to a team quite as much as the field when they're this popular. And it's not like we have them for way more chance of success than any other team. We have them with 13% chance to be the top stack on the slate compared to that 15% ownership share. So if I'm paying up for an offense, like I'd rather go to the Cubs, who have a third of the ownership that the Yankees do right now.
That makes some sense. Definitely a little bit of a window of insight into how Greg approaches these slates and gets some of his results. And, I think to me, I feel like sometimes spots are too good to avoid. And I think even Greg is sort of saying that here, where if you're getting less exposure, you're still not ruling them out entirely. And sometimes we've had Yankees on the slate where Alex has talked about just ruling out the Yankees entirely because of their ownership. And I think this is one I would just be reluctant to do that if you are, especially playing your first MLB DFS slate. Get creative with the exposures, get creative with how you're configuring things, maybe, limit that 5-man stack. But I would say try to get some Yankees in the mix because this is one of the better situations on paper. Speaking of better situations on paper, on the other side, we have Gerrit Cole getting 56% ownership on DraftKings, comparably high numbers on Fanduel as well. And he has a 41% K rate for himself, 40.8% if you want to be a stickler about the numbers, a 2 xFIP. The numbers from this year, Greg, have just been outrageous. The home runs certainly should be coming up at some point, a 1.6% home run rate for himself compared to 3.5% historically. But besides that, everything else here looks good. The swing strike rate, the chase rate are in line with where they should be. His velocity's actually been up a little bit this year. So I don't know if there's anything you could poke holes in with Gerrit Cole, Greg, but I think by how we approach pitching here, hard to sort of argue against the ownership because there's just no flaws really to point to that you could expect to be much worse for him.
Yeah, and then you look at his strikeout numbers for the year, and other than one game that was kind of wonky against the Houston Astros, where actually he generated a decent amount of swing and misses, but just didn't get strikeouts. There was only 4 in that game, but beyond that, at least 8 strikeouts in every game so far this year. He said double-digit strikeouts in 4 of the last 5 games, and since opening day, Garrett Cole has scored under 26 DraftKings points once. So the odds of him landing in the optimal lineup, or not even the optimal lineup, just the odds of him finding success on this slate, it's very, very high. The odds of him having a bad game, it just doesn't happen all that often. And in reality, even if you get a floor game for Garrett Cole where he scores, like 16 to 20 DraftKings points, it's not going to kill your lineup. So there's so much variance in baseball, and I talk about this a lot, and I think that maybe it's something to talk about a little bit more because maybe we have some, different or newer viewers than we normally have because there's no basketball today. But I really like paying up for pitching. Even if the guys are really chalky, I generally still tend to be overweight to spots on guys like Garrett Cole, who has a reasonably decent matchup against the Texas Rangers team that strikes out a lot. And he's such a good starting pitcher that this is one place that I feel like we could pretty reliably just lock in a high amount of fantasy points. And you just can't really do that with really any other spot in baseball.
So I guess relative to ownership, Greg, because you mentioned we do probably have some people out there who are playing MLB for the first time. I know we had our guy, Pete the Heat, who I'm sure is no stranger to MLB, but probably has a little more time in his life with his NBA exposures. And now after Josh ruined the strategy show without Pete on Saturday, I'm sure he's probably just dying to get back into the game, play some DFS, right the wrongs here of Josh just being there, killing that seat. But we do have Gerrit Cole at 56% ownership. So is this a spot where you'd be over the field on him, even with the top pitcher tool saying that he does have a 42% chance of being the top pitcher?
Yeah, I am very overweight to him in my initial build. He's my most rostered player by a really wide margin in the dummy build I made this morning. He's in 83% of my lineups right now. I just really like the security of being able to pay up for the pitchers. I'm actually overweight to Garrett Cole and Yu Darvish in my initial build, and then just tried to mix in a lot of cheaper hitters. But I feel like especially if you're playing a bunch of lineups, that's a way to, at the very least, kind of lock in a lot of them cashing. More often than not is just by paying up for some of these pitchers that offer so much more stability than any other position.
Something to keep in mind too, because some of the tournaments out there today, if you are playing MLB DFS for the first time, DraftKings running a $5 tournament, FanDuel has their $4 tournament. So if you're trying to max one out today with a 150 max and keep up, which is something that we do talk about here, where you should be maxing out the tournaments that you can afford, obviously, whether it be a 20 max, whether it be a single entry or a 3 max or all of that. There are some cheaper tournaments up there, so keep that in mind today. Some of Greg's strategies definitely going to help somebody out there today. Texas hitters, though, Greg, you want to get there at all? It is Gerrit Cole on the other side. It is also a very good Yankees bullpen, really, I think the best one on the slate in pretty much every category. So I don't see any reason to get much in the way of Texas hitters. I guess you could see one of these guys pop a home run here. Adolis Garcia has been very good against lefty hitters so far, only 75 at bats, but a 368 BABIP for himself. It's probably going to come down, but a 242 ISO, it does show a good amount of power. Is there anybody here you're seeing meaningfully? I know we had some Joey Gallo touting in the chat. Is any Texas hitters that you'd want to get to?
No, not really. I don't like. There are ways to get contrarian with stacking offenses, and especially against chalk starting pitchers, but not when it's somebody who's the caliber of Garrett Cole. So, like later, we're going to talk about Yusei Kikuchi, who I do think is an overall good play, but he's also really popular. And I think there's leverage in stacking against somebody who's that popular, just because there's a lot more chance for Kikuchi to fail than somebody like Garrett Cole. So, even though we do have the Rangers in our top stack still going a little bit under owned, it's only because they're picking up 0% ownership, but their odds of success are still really low. We have them the 1.7% chance being the top stack on the slate, which is the lowest by a pretty good margin. The only two teams, or there's three teams that have basically almost no chance of being the top stack. That is the Diamondbacks, the Rockies, and the Rangers. So it's just too low odds of probability for me to want to get to them.
Or at about the halfway point of this show, or I guess of our coverage of these games, guys. So hit that like button if you can, and make sure you are subscribed to the channel. We have content going on all day long. As I mentioned earlier in the show, we'll have the MLB deeper dive and then usual NBA deeper dive time. So that'll be at 5 p.m. East Coast time, 2 p.m. West Coast time. So tune into that, and it'll be followed by Live Before Lock with Eitan and Greg. So you can catch me and Greg one more time talking about the slate with some new pairings with us. So make sure to go tune into those later today. We got Cleveland 4 implied runs against Patrick Sandoval. Patrick Sandoval, another cheap pitcher who has a middling projection for himself, has only pitched about 2.5 innings per start this year. So I guess he's sort of more of a glorified opener, but maybe with the potential to go slightly deeper in the game based upon Awesemo's projection for him. But Sandoval, Greg, another guy who really doesn't offer up a lot, of 24% carried for himself this year. Going back to 2019, a 23% carried. That would be right around league average. Does give up a good amount of power as well, a 9% on run rate this year, 5.3% since 2019. Sandoval, another guy, I just don't see the point in playing a lot of him under owned on the top pitchers tool. He does have a good chance about being a top value. So if there are some pricey lineups to get to alongside Garrett Cole, I guess that's sort of the main utility Sandoval has. But do you see any options at all to play Sandoval for yourself, Greg?
No, I think, well, the biggest issue here is he hasn't made a start this year. He's just been pitching out of the bullpen. So I assume this is just kind of an opener spot. Like I think I don't think he's going to necessarily only pitch one inning, but I don't think he's going to go deeper than say, 3 or 4 innings either. So that makes it really hard for me to get to him. Maybe if he was 4,000, you could talk me into it a little bit, but he's been priced up to 5,200. And I mean, like we said, he's pitched 7 innings in 3 outings so far this year. So 2 or 3 innings, that's probably the most likely outcome for Sandoval here. And also, he hasn't pitched well in those innings so far this year. He's a 6.14 ERA and 8.33 expected ERA. Last year, a 5.65 ERA, a 5.34 expected ERA. So to me, Sandoval, a pitcher who's not been particularly good, that is probably also going to pitch a couple innings.
It's also a Cleveland team that doesn't strike out a lot, of 20.6% K rate for themselves against left-hand pitching this year. This lineup today has about a 20% aggregate K rate for themselves. So not a great spot for Sandoval. And if the price tag works, I get getting there a little bit, but certainly not a guy to expect much from. Cleveland's hitters, a lot of ownership going to Jordan Luplow, who has historically mashed lefties pretty well with a 337 ISO since 2019 for himself. Besides that, though, not a lot of ownership for the Cleveland hitters. And I think to me, this is a spot where I don't mind going to the stack. It's not one of the hotter days, but it is still a park that plays pretty well for power. So I think Cleveland's hitters, Greg, stack that I don't mind here. And Jose Ramirez, certainly a perhaps to be contrarian option with just about 6.5% ownership expected on DraftKings.
Yeah. So in my initial build, the Indians are the team that I stack the most. Number one, we don't have them picking up all that much ownership as the team. But the other thing also, we have them with an 11.6% chance to be the top value stack on the slate. So the only teams with a higher chance of being a top value today are the Seattle Mariners, who are also picking up a ton of ownership, and then the Detroit Tigers. So when I look at the Cleveland Indians, number one, it's a team that's cheap and also has chance of success, also doesn't have a whole lot of ownership. Then also I just mentioned, number one, the struggles of Sandoval. We also don't know how deep he's going to work into the game. But to me, I have a lot of concerns about how good Sandoval is in general. And I think that all this plays really well to an Indians offense, that everything that I look for on an offense, especially on a slate where I'm looking to pay up for pitching and they're relatively cheap, this is a team that's a very high priority for me.
The pitcher on the other side, probably worth a spot where we could save sometimes. Sam Manches, probably more of a glorified opener, pitching about 2.5 innings per appearance, much like Sandoval here, but even lower projection from Awesemo at a higher price tag. So it does seem like a guy that's probably not worth getting into the player pool very much, especially going against an Angels team that doesn't strike out very much either. 20.8% K rate for themselves against left-hand pitching on the year. The Angels hitters, though, are going to be pretty decently owned, Greg. It looks like they are a little bit higher probability to be a top stack than their ownership, but that's a fractional amount that could easily change by the time we get gets a lock. 5 implied total for these guys. A lot of ownership going to Taylor Ward, so that is one way to decrease the ownership of the stack if Ward doesn't end up in the leadoff spot. Another cheap leadoff guy. Really, in general, cheap leadoff guys who don't do a lot, guys that I don't mind getting out of stacks right away just to get that ownership product down. For the rest of these guys, for the most part, we had some questions from our guy Brian in the chat asking about Ohtani earlier. I know you are a big Ohtani fan, even though his split's not quite as good against lefties as they are against righties. Still certainly a viable hitter in the 2-hole. But what are you doing with the Angels? Are you willing to get there heavy? Are you going under the field? Because this is one to me that right now they look under-owned, but I do think by the time you get to lock, I think that those numbers flip a little bit here where they'll probably be over-owned on the top stack stool by the time we get there.
Yeah, I mean, right now they look about appropriately owned. So at least in the build I have right now, I'm right about even with the field. The one thing I will mention as a one-off, we have Mike Trout projected for very low ownership right now. And if Mike Trout is actually going to be in this 7% ownership range by the time the slate locks, I think that he's somebody who makes a bunch of sense to pay up to be contrarian with, especially as a one-off. Because Mike Trout, I don't think there's really ever any slate where he warrants only 7% ownership. So Mike Trout, if you're playing a bunch of lineups, I recommend going overweight to the field on him. The Angels as a stack, though, they just look about appropriately owned right now.
All right, we got another game here with Colorado, 2.6 implied runs against Yu Darvish. This game will be in San Diego, so keep that in mind for anybody out there who's always trying to go to Colorado. If you're playing MLB DFS for the first time, the Coors Field effect does not travel with the Rockies, as you can tell by that low implied total. And Darvish's strikeout stuff on the year has been not quite as good as Garrett Cole. I think you do have to put him, not a tier behind Cole, but certainly enough behind with that $500 price tag. It's not quite as close as it might seem, I think, with the DFS pricing here. Darvish on the year, a 31% K rate for himself. Not giving up a lot of power, probably due to regress a little bit there. Has had a 3.5% on run rate since 2019, only 2.6% this year. Fly ball rate's been really high for Yu Darvish, which gives me a little concern that there could be some bad stuff coming as the weather does heat up, as we talked about throughout the show. But Darvish, an easy number 2 pitcher on the slate, Greg. I think one, to me, looks a little bit over-owned as the number 2 pitcher on the slate. I'd rather go to Cole, and I think the ownership is closer than it should be. But how are you feeling about Darvish? I think still, if you're not playing Cole, and I guess maybe in some lineups you can play them both together potentially, but Darvish does seem like a very easy, clear-cut number 2 pitcher on the slate.
Yeah, I'm overweight to the field on Darvish, but like you said, I do have a lean towards Garrett Cole right now. If we want to make a case for Darvish versus Cole, just in terms of which one to get more ownership to, if you wanted to go heavier with Darvish, the reason would be the matchup. Because the Colorado Rockies, like you said, the Coors Field does not travel with them on the road. And this is a team that has historically, just year in and year out, they always end up being one of the worst offense in baseball on the road just because a lot of their numbers get buoyed by playing at Coors Field, and they've just had a lot of bad offenses in recent years. So the Rockies this year against right-handed pitching, 74 WRC plus, dead last in baseball. So the matchup really couldn't be much better for Yu Darvish. The strikeout numbers have always been excellent for him, like you mentioned, 31.2% strikeout rate. Actually pretty crazy. Look at the last 3 years, because he's had a 31.3% strikeout rate, 31.3%, and then 31.2%. So pretty remarkable consistency there. He's going to most likely strike out a bunch of guys. The only question here is Yu Darvish or Garrett Cole. To me, I'm overweight to both, but I do have more exposure to Cole.
Colorado hitters also not that great. Low implied total for them. Some guys in the lineup, they are going to get some more at bats moving forward. Connor Joe has been decent overall in the year, getting on base. The 484 clip for himself against right-handers. And I don't know if he's related to Isaiah Joe, another guy who just seems very generic on the Sixers organization, but still another athlete here to keep in mind who is going to be very cheap today, much like Isaiah Joe is at points for the Sixers in the NBA if you are somebody who's switching over from NBA DFS. But the Colorado hitters, I feel like going against Darvish in this spot, not ones I'd be dying to get to at all, Greg. So give me your quick thoughts on them, because I'm going to assume you're also feeling similarly.
Yeah, I could do it in one word, and that is fade. I just don't see a real reason to go here to the Colorado Rockies hitters. There are a bunch of viable teams on the slate. We only have them with a 2.2% chance to be the top scoring team of the day. Terrible road offense, also just generally terrible against right-handed pitching. Also, Yu Darvish is one of the overall best starting pitchers in baseball. So team that I don't have interest in.
Yeah, good bullpen behind him too, much like Garrett Cole. So really, I think that does make it easier to not consider the stack too much today. John Gray on the other side is another pitcher who has done the best he can to weather the storm of pitching in Colorado for the most part. And on the year has a league average 22.9% K rate for himself, which is actually up on his longer term sample size. 21.5% K rate for John Gray since 2019. Gray is going to be owned a little bit, but does have a higher probability to be a top pitcher. I'm not dying for John Gray here, though I do think he is a lower owned pivot to Max Fried if you wanted to go know there, but I think that's sort of the main case you can make for him, is that he's a less lower projected version of pitchers that are going to be probably a bit higher owned.
Yeah, he's pitched pretty well this year. Last year was kind of a weird year for Jon Gray, and I think we could just kind of throw it out because the numbers were terrible for him, but also he only made 8 starts, and then he also makes, a lot of his starts at Coors Field. But even that aside, if you look at his numbers just this year, striking out about a hitter per inning, 2.93 ERA, 2.92 expected ERA. Obviously, it's a really difficult matchup against the San Diego Padres, which is always going to give me a little bit of pause. But considering he's only projected for 5% ownership right now, he is a pitcher that, given how well he's pitched this year, and also that his numbers are always going to look maybe a little bit better if we could just take him outside of Coors Field, I think that he's somebody to at least be overweight to the 5% number.
And the Padres hitters, I think the expectation is no Fernando Tatis today, so that makes the lineup look worse on paper, but you're still getting a lot of ownership for these guys, over in the neighborhood of 15% for guys like Trent Grisham, Jake Cronenworth, Tommy Pham, Brian O'Grady, and Ha-Seong Kim. All these guys can be very highly owned, and I just don't know that I love this Padres stack, which I think to me makes me like Jon Gray a little more, even though getting leverage to the pitcher going to be harder to do. But I just think it's a pretty weak lineup by Padres standards, assuming that, again, Tatis is going to be out for this. So I don't love the spot for the Padres, and I don't get why they're quite as owned as they are. I think the price tags work, and that to me is a play I don't mind moving away from because it's probably coming up a lot in optimizers.
Yeah, so the Padres, relative to teams that are actually viable, they're my least favorite stack on the slate. So, I mean, it's easy to say go fade the Rockies, go fade the Rangers because they're going up against Yu Darvish and Garrett Cole. But as far as a team that's actually a good offense and is picking up ownership, the 10% is not warranted for the Padres on this slate. Like I mentioned, Jon Gray, he struggled last year, except he's been really good so far this year. The 2.93 ERA, 2.92 expected ERA, striking out about a hitter per inning. So Jon Gray to me is not a pitcher that I'm generally dying to stack against unless it's a Coors Field game. And now that we also throw in all this ownership for the Padres, this is a team that right now I don't have any stacks of them. I have 0%. The only way that would change is if that ownership comes way down.
All right, next game up here, we got 2 more to hit on. Walker Buehler, who's going to be priced comparably to Yu Darvish and Garrett Cole, but it's not. He got the same results for himself this year, only a 27.6% K rate for himself, which actually been down from the 28.8% mark that he's had since 2019. Also giving up more home runs, a 4.7% rate, though his whip has actually been down to a 0.9 whip, so I think there are probably some more preventative things going well for Buehler than there are the actual strikeout upside. But Buehler, I think with the lack of strikeout ability, lack of strikeout ability compared to guys like Yu Darvish and Garrett Cole, I think he's a very clear-cut number 3, and honestly, he'd be a guy that the field's going to be on him a third of the time, Greg. I don't mind getting a lot less than that. I feel like Buehler was a fine play on a normal slate, especially one where you don't have the stud pitchers who get a lot of strikeouts, but on one like this, I just feel like he's very clearly behind Yu Darvish and Garrett Cole in terms of the fantasy upside.
Yeah, totally agree. He's somebody who is in my player pool right now, but about half percentage that the field has right now, and I could even see that number going lower by the time we get to lock. It's not really a knock on Buehler. The strikeouts are down a little bit this year. He's just not the same caliber of starting pitcher that Garrett Cole and Yu Darvish are, and he's fairly expensive. So, I mean, if we look at the price of Walker Buehler, Yu Darvish is only $200 more expensive. Garrett Cole is $900 more expensive on DraftKings. Fanduel, there's a little bit more of a price gap where Walker Buehler is only $9,900, and then Yu Darvish is $11,100, and Garrett Cole is $12,300. But even so, I'd rather find the salary space to pay up for those guys. So Walker Buehler, if you're only playing a handful of lineups, I would say don't consider him. If you're somebody who plays 150 lineups like I do, have him in the player pool, but still be underweight to the field on him because I think that he is a far third option behind Cole and Darvish.
Yeah, 24% chance of being a top pitcher today with 33% ownership. And that top pitcher's tool is free today. So check it out throughout the day for updates. But definitely right now looks too overowned for what he is, especially compared that you do have Yu Darvish and Garrett Cole on the slate. The Arizona hitters, though, still also not looking that appealing to me. It is a pretty solid Dodgers bullpen, though they have been down a little bit this year compared to where they were the last few seasons. But going against Buehler, I think, he has really done well in terms of just production prevention overall with that 0.9 whip for himself. And even if he's not getting strikeouts, I don't know that Arizona's going to be able to get enough done here. So to me as a stack, Greg, Arizona looks mostly unappealing. Yeah,
totally agree. Maybe I like them a little bit better than the Rangers or the Rockies, but that's still not saying much. We do them with a 6.1% chance to be the top value stack on the slate, which, maybe moderately appealing, but the Diamondbacks are a team that I don't think I'm going to leave them out of my player pool entirely, as I am with the Rockies and the Rangers, but it's going to be very, very low ownership for them to me. We have them with 1.5% ownership with the field right now, so I have them at 3% right now, and you could talk me into lowering that by the time the slate locks. So Diamondbacks, I don't think you have to fade them outright, but it's a really bad spot. And once again, if you're only playing 1 to 3 lineups, I would not roster the Diamondbacks in that situation.
On the other side, we have Madison Bumgarner, who has shown some signs of life this year, up to a 27.5% K rate for himself, has had a 1.01 whip as well this season. So things have started to look a little bit better than they had the last few years, where he's been getting shelled by pretty much everybody. But there are still, I think, some concerning signs. He's given up a good amount of hard contact, 41% hard contact rate for himself. The launch angle this year, 23.5, would be the highest mark in the slate. And that's probably right around where he needs to be to hit home runs. And he is facing a Dodgers lineup that does have, or should have, more strikeouts in it than usual. The projected lineup here, bottom of the order, has guys like Sheldon Noose, Luke Raley, DJ Peters, as well as Walker Buehler himself. So it is a weaker Dodgers lineup than usual that I could see getting to Madison Bumgarner more than the 4% the field's going to be on, Greg. Not a play I'm comfortable with at all, but I do think Bumgarner's shown enough signs of life. And even though I expect that to sort of regress the other way, it's not the hottest day in LA today either. So I think there's a lot of signs here that are going positively for Bumgarner. Weak Dodgers lineup plus positive weather, plus the fact that I think there are some strikeouts to be had.
I had totally written Madison Bumgarner off, and I've been making fun of him for a while now because there was a really long period of time, it was like a year ago or 2 years ago at this point, where sportsbooks were just pricing Madison Bumgarner as a favorite for almost all of his starts. I guess because of the name value on him. And to me, I just always thought he was a really easy pitcher to target against in DFS and for betting purposes. But the market finally adjusted to him, and then he became good again. So Madison Bumgard, he scored over 20 DraftKings points in 5 games in a row. Of course, the highlight was that somewhat questionable no-hitter game, just because it was a 7-inning game, and then there was debate whether it should count, whether it shouldn't count in the history books. But I mean, either way, it was a no-hitter. Not only was it 7 shutout innings without a hit, it came on the road against the Atlanta Braves, who are overall one of the most talented offenses in baseball. So I mean, I look at Madison Bumgarner, and still the velocity is way down from his peak years. But even so, I mean, for the year, the last handful of starts have been good. He got off to a rocky start this season, but 4.12 ERA, the underlying numbers suggest he's gotten unlucky. He has a 3.4 expected ERA, 3.41 FIP. I think Madison Bumgarner might just be decent now. And I can't tell you exactly why that's the case because, it's not like he's all of a sudden somebody's throwing 93 miles per hour again or anything like that. And it's not like his picks Mitch is significantly different, but he's getting better results. So I have a little bit of interest in Madison Bumgarner, at least more than the field does. I think that he's an okay contrarian pitching option, and I think that he's just good enough to where I don't really want to stack the Dodgers either.
Yeah, I would agree with that take as well. Bumgarner, I think also a pivot to a lot of ownership going to Yusei Kikuchi in that SP2 spot. So I think some things here to consider with Bumgarner that if he does get that upside day, I would agree with Greg. I think 3.5% ownership is too low for him just based on what we've seen this year. Won't shock me to see it regress, but I do think based on what we've seen from him, you just got to kind of trust that. The Dodgers lineup too, as I mentioned, just looks weaker than usual here. You still have a pretty good top 5 of these guys, but Will Smith also does struggle against lefties in a pretty appreciable way. So I think that's something to keep in mind. I really don't know everybody else in the Dodgers that looks, I mean, obviously you're going to have the usual guys who look good. Mookie Betts also a worse hitter against lefties. For the most part, to me, I agree with you. I think the Dodgers hitters going to be owned a little more than they should just because they're the Dodgers. And if this lineup is what the one that's projected is, again, with guys like Raley and Peters and Nunez or Noose at the bottom of the order, I just don't like the Dodgers lineup at all.
Yeah, and the good hitters are pretty expensive, right? I mean, we've got Mookie Betts at 5,900. Corey Seager was off to a great start this year, but now he's going to be out for a while because he got injured the other day. Max Muncy's 5,200. Will Smith, 4,700, even though he's a good hitter for a catcher. Justin Turner, 5,100. So not only do I think that Bumgarner at this point might actually be a little bit underrated, but then we also have a somewhat depleted Dodgers offense, and the guys that are actually viable hitters are so expensive that they don't fit in with the pitchers I want to roster. So to me, the Dodgers, who also we have going over-owned in the top stacks tool, this is a low priority offense.
All right, we got the last game on the slate here. People already. We got Dustin in the chat saying, "Give me all the Kikuchi, lock it up." So this is how people are going to view Yusei Kikuchi today in this last game, going against the Tigers team. 3.4 implied runs for them from Vegas. Kikuchi on the year has been better in terms of strikeouts, 26% K rate for himself. Also pitching over 6 innings per start, really has turned it around in a meaningful way. Where going back to 2019 was giving up a 19% K rate, a 4% home run rate, also a 211 ISO overall to everybody. These numbers have all trended downward, Greg, in a way that it does seem like Kikuchi has been a new man this year, and he's facing a Detroit lineup with a 34% K rate against left-hand pitching on the year. And on paper, it does seem like Kikuchi is going to be very hard for people to ignore, but we know how it goes in baseball. So how are you handling Kikuchi on a day where he has a 18% chance of being a top pitcher? Certainly one of the better value options, but the field is certainly aware when you have people just coming into YouTube chats excited to talk about Kikuchi and locking him in.
Yeah, and it's hard not to also when you look at the Detroit Tigers, who have a 55 WRC plus against left-handed pitching this year, which is by such a wide margin the worst offense against lefties in the league. So the Seattle Mariners have a 75 WRC plus against lefties. They're 29th in baseball. And then you get all the way down to a 55 WRC plus with the Tigers. So by a really, really wide margin, they have been the worst in baseball against lefties. Like you said about Kikuchi, the strikeouts are up this year. Also, if you look at his numbers since coming into the league, I don't know what he did to make this happen, but his first year from Japan, maybe he was pitching hurt, 92.6 average mile per hour is on his fastball velocity. Last year, 95.1. This year up to 95.5. So we had a guy with not low velocity, but pretty nondescript velocity to now all of a sudden becoming one of the hardest throwing left-handed starters in baseball. So it's not a surprise to see him finding a little bit more success, and it's a great matchup against the Tigers. So without a doubt, I have interest in Kikuchi because of that. I just don't have quite as much interest in the field. My priority is trying to get cheap hitters and pay up for Yu Darvish and Garrett Cole. But in my build right now, I do have Yusei Kikuchi as my third most rostered starting pitcher. But it still has me a little bit underweight to the field on him just because of how popular he is right now by the field.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable. Kikuchi, I think I'll be closer to the field than Greg might be here. I feel like he, to me, is a guy to put in a third of the lineup, to just kind of hope that you end up either, with the field or a little bit closer to it than you might normally want to be. But I think the spot against Detroit's too good to ignore. That said, there's something that jumps out to me with Detroit, these lefty matches where they have been so bad on the year, but you look at the numbers since 2019, like guys like Cabrera, guys like Goodrum, guys like Candelario should be getting on base at least more. They don't have a ton of pop, but Scope has some pop. Like, it does sort of strike me that they should be better against lefties than the absolute dregs that Greg mentioned here, that 55 WRC plus, a .067 ISO. Like, I do think these numbers regress at some point, and maybe that does coincide with Kikuchi having a worse day, but it's sort of hard to pin your hopes on that majorly today. I could see stacking up a little bit of Tigers, but we're also going to have Scope and Cabrera owned over 10% on DraftKings because they're so cheap. So I don't know, Greg, do you see any options at all for the Detroit hitters to get very obvious leverage on Kikuchi if he does, sort of regress a little bit closer to what he's been historically?
Yeah, I actually do like the Tigers more than the field does, just because we have them with a 3.6% chance to be the top stock on the slate. That's really low, 3.5% odd, 3.5 ownership. So that in itself looks about fair, but then you consider they have an 11.9% chance to be the top value on the slate. So I consider that with also the starting pitchers that I'm looking to roster on the slate. And I could easily stack the Tigers with Yu Darvish and Garrett Cole. I'm also getting leverage off of Yusei Kikuchi. So just think of it in this scenario. With the way we have the ownership going to the pitchers, there's 4 very, very popular starters today: Kikuchi, Walker Buehler, Garrett Cole, and Yu Darvish. If Cole and Darvish both pitch well and Kikuchi gets hit hard, number one, it seems pretty clear to me in that scenario that Cole and Darvish are probably going to end up being the optimal pitching combination. But then you also start to say, like, okay, well, what happens if Kikuchi doesn't have a good game? It means the Tigers probably had a relatively good game. So I consider all of that together, and it's really appealing for me to make Tiger stacks and GPPs at a higher rate than the field, get leverage off Kikuchi, and then also be able to roster them with Cole and Darvish. I think that's a pretty slick GPP combo for today.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. With Casey Mize on the other side, another guy who has not pitched that well, certainly not up to the pedigree or the thoughts of what he was supposed to be as a prospect, but a 16.5% K rate for himself this year, 4.8 xFIP. Those numbers basically in line with his longer-term sample size going back to last season as well. 17.8% K rate if you are to go back that far. He's facing a Seattle team that's going to be pretty highly owned. I think a lot of enthusiasm for getting guys like Jared Kelenic in the mix, and he's certainly hit well so far, so at least in terms of hitting for power. But I think this enthusiasm enthusiasm for Seattle is wild. I know Mize has been really bad, but there's a lot of ownership going to the Seattle stack here. They are projected to be about twice as owned as their chance to be a top stack today, and they are cheap enough, so I guess they open up value. But I think it's almost enough, Greg, to consider going to Casey Mize a value option at least a little bit, with a higher percent or higher probability to be a top pitcher, higher probability to be a top value pitcher on the slate than the 1% ownership he's going to have.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, 1% ownership. It always you could always say that somebody has a greater than 1% chance to be the top to be the top pitcher. But I think the upside for Casey Mize still doesn't really exist all that much, because if I'm looking for a low owned pitcher, maybe against, if it was a good offense, I know the Mariners don't have a good offense, but I would be looking for a guy who's at least high variance with strikeout upside. Like Casey Mize is just not generating swing and misses this year, and he's given up a lot of runs, a 16.5% strikeout rate. So I think he's going to be really relying on just throwing strikes and the ball being hit at guys to find a little bit of success, which maybe that's enough so that the Mariners don't have a great game individually as an offense. But I don't think it's very likely that Casey Mize is some sort of slate-breaking performance just based on his inability to generate swing and misses at this point in his career.
How are you feeling about the Seattle stack? Then they do have 4.6 implied runs, and they do have a matchup against Casey Mize, who has not been good, as we talked about. Also a bad bullpen behind him. The Detroit bullpen giving up a 1.7 whip for themselves, 4.3% on run rate, so lots of troubling signs for them as well. Are you willing to get to a Seattle stack at all, given the fact that you're going to have over 20% ownership for guys like Dylan Moore and Kelenic, and you're also going to have over 15% ownership for guys like Kyle Seager and JP Crawford?
Yeah, so I mean, they're cheap enough to where I feel like I have to get some exposure to them to be able to make some of those lineups with Darvish and Cole, and I think that's what the field is doing too. Like, I don't think the field is super confident in the Seattle Mariners. I think it's number one, a fade of Casey Mize, but then number two, it fits into what I think most people view as the optimal lineup construction for today. So I'm going to have some Mariners stacks. However, if I'm going to a cheap offense, I'd rather get the Tigers for less ownership, and I'd rather get the Indians for less ownership. So my two priority cheaper stacks are going to be those teams over the Mariners. They're cheap enough, and Casey Mize has pitched poorly enough to where I think it makes sense to get to them, but not quite at the 12.5% of the field's rostering them.
Also, Morgan in the YouTube chat saying Kelenic has had one good game so far. Yes, that is, I agree. And I think that's something to keep in mind here, where he's cheap hitting the leadoff spot, but he has really only had one good game, and the field looks like about a quarter of the field will be on him. So if you are not team Kelenic, get under that number. I know I'll be certainly at least maxing out at a half that, but I do think that's one way to get different right away. A lot of people, we talk a lot about in DFS, the shiny new toy, and Kelenic is one of those shiny new toys that people, I'm sure, saw the ESPN headlines about, a guy who's been bandied about a lot because of his role in getting the Mariners GM fired and all that. Any final thoughts, Greg? Any final tips for the people out there playing their first MLB slate, maybe playing a lot of money today because of those big tournaments with cheap entry fees?
Roster Garrett Cole, roster Yu Darvish. Definitely be on the lookout for any cheaper hitters that make their way into the starting lineup that maybe aren't picking up a whole lot of ownership. But Garrett Cole, Yu Darvish, they are popular, but I'm still going to be overweight to the field on them. And then for offenses, overall, my favorite stack of the day is the Cleveland Indians, who are cheap. I could stack them up with the top pitchers, and then also they're not picking up all that much ownership right now.
Yeah, watch that ownership as best you can. Remember that top pitchers tool is free today. If you want to get some more MLB data for yourself, go to Awesemo.com/join and use that promo code GOLDRUSH to get 25% off of your first month of all the Awesemo Plus data. That includes MLB, the NBA still going on, PGA, MMA, NASCAR, NHL, everything that's going on right now. There are projections and ownership projections and data for it. So make sure to go to Awesemo.com/join. Use that promo code GOLDRUSH. Greg, give people the plug for yourself right now before we jump off.
Yeah, I'm going to be on Live Before Lock later today with Aton, so definitely check that out. It's pretty rare that we're able to do an MLB Live Before Lock show, actually before leading up to MLB Lock, because there's usually basketball going on, which is obviously a higher priority. But yeah, expect this to be a little bit more popular than usual. And yeah, jump in, ask a lot of questions, because I assume we're going to be answering a lot of them.
Check out the deeper dive right before that as well. I'll be on that today with Alex and Terry. We're moving that to 5 p.m. Eastern time, 2 p.m. Pacific time today. So we're doing basically the usual run leading up to lock here of shows. So make sure you're watching both of those. Check me out on the tip off too at 4 p.m. Eastern today. And we'll see how that one goes. I don't even know what we're going to talk about today, because I guess a lot of MLB. You'll find out what Eric puts in the run sheet. I'm sure there might be a sing along at some point, or who knows what. But follow at Ehrenberg Dfs, follow at Chris Spags, follow at Awesemo_com to check out all of our content and random flash giveaways and stuff that go through there all the time. We appreciate you guys for being here. Check out those shows later today. See you guys again soon. Good luck.